A woman is wrongfully arrested and sexually abused by two police officers. However, what they didn't anticipate was that their actions would lead them straight into a hell with no way out. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back." The voice was curt, cold. It cut through the late evening hush like a rusty blade. The sun had just dipped below the rooftops of Oak Ridge Lane, casting a golden haze over the neighborhood's aging porches and neatly trimmed hedges. Kimberly Reyes slowed her car as the red and blue strobe of police cruisers bounced across the windows of her neighbors' homes. A quiet street. Too quiet for all this. She parked by the curb engine idling. A dozen feet away, 3 uniformed officers stood outside Mrs. Ramona Vasquez's door, an elderly woman whose hands still smelled of cinnamon and rosewater, who never missed church or a Sunday casserole swap. The old woman's silhouette trembled behind the screen door. Kimberly stepped out, her shoulders stiff from hours hunched over case files. She didn't wear her badge or her blazer, just jeans, a gray windbreaker, and sneakers. She didn't want to startle anyone. She approached calmly, hands visible. "Excuse me, officers. Is everything all right with Mrs. Vasquez?" 2 of them turned young, coiled tight faces, flushed with tension or ego. One she recognized from past complaints, whispered between neighbors. Maddox, the other with a fresh buzz cut and a jaw that flexed when idle Oliver. Both had the look of men who enjoyed being the ones with the flashlights and the questions. "Keep walking." Maddox snapped, not even glancing fully her way. "This is an active scene." "She's my neighbor," Kimberly replied. "And this street isn't a crime scene. May I ask if you have a warrant?" Oliver turned slowly, a smug grin creeping across his lips. "Lady, you asking about warrants now?" "What are you, a lawyer?" "No," she said evenly. "I just know the Fourth Amendment." That was enough. Maddox stepped forward, his boots thudding hard against the sidewalk. "You interfering?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Kimberly kept her gaze steady. "I'm standing on public property asking a civil question." Oliver moved behind her with eerie precision. "Let's not do the whole know your rights routine tonight," he muttered. Then before she could finish inhaling for her next sentence, Maddox shoved her back. The movement wasn't chaotic, it was practiced, deliberate. Kimberly stumbled, catching herself on the low fence that separated Mrs. Vasquez's yard from the sidewalk. Her left hip hit the post. "I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction," Maddox barked, already reaching for his cuffs. Oliver moved in from behind, too close, too fast. "Turn around, hands behind your back." "I haven't," she started, but Oliver yanked her arms back with unnecessary force. Metal clinked, bit her skin. Pain flared in her shoulder. "Should have stayed in your lane, sweetheart," he whispered close to her ear. The scent of his cologne, harsh and synthetic, made her stomach churn. She didn't fight, didn't scream. Years of fieldwork taught her the cost of escalation. The patrol car door opened with a groan. Maddox pushed her down into the back seat, the leather sticky and hot against her thighs. No words were spoken until they were inside the vehicle. The doors closed. Then the real talk began. "You one of those activist types?" Maddox said, twisting in the passenger seat to look back at her. "Marches and signs and TikToks." Oliver laughed. "Nah, she's too polished for that. Probably teaches social justice at a college or blogs." Kimberly said nothing. Silence. She knew was a weapon. "You married?" Oliver asked. "No ring." "Figures." Got that bossy tone probably chased every man off. His words hung in the stale air. The engine idled. She stared at the mesh divider, her eyes resting on a smudge shaped like a fingerprint, a small one like a child's. The steel door shut behind her with a groan, locking out the hallway and its echoes. Inside the cell reeked of bleach and iron. Kimberly didn't move. Not at first. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the harsh fluorescent light tracing the cracks on the concrete wall. A single bench jutted out from the far side, bolted down the edges, worn smooth by decades of restless occupants. Her wrists ached, thin welts already forming beneath the cuffs. The left shoulder throbbed from how Oliver had wrenched her arms behind her back. She let the pain settle, memorized it, not as suffering, as evidence. Footsteps echoed 2 sets. They stopped just outside the door, a jingle of keys. The lock clicked. Maddox walked in first, slower this time, like a man surveying property. Oliver followed, leaning against the doorframe, chewing something with exaggerated nonchalance. "You still feeling chatty, sweetheart?" Maddox asked, voice low and flat. Kimberly didn't answer. Maddox took 2 steps forward, boots tapping lightly on the floor. "Or maybe that attitude's cooled off a bit now. You're not on the sidewalk acting brave." Oliver chuckled. "She ain't even asking for a phone call, like she knows nobody's coming." She did not respond. Silence wasn't just defiance, it was preservation. Maddox crouched in front of her. She kept her back straight, her eyes on the corner of the room where the grout was stained. "You got a name?" he asked. She blinked once. "Okay," he said, standing. "You want to play it tough? That's fine. But see, down here. No badge, no podium, no audience, just you and us." Oliver shut the door behind him. The click was deliberate. Time blurred. Their voices moved around her like smoke, sometimes mocking, sometimes quiet, always circling. Questions dressed as comments. Hands brushing shoulders that didn't need touching. Too much space invaded, too few cameras blinking red. They wanted a reaction, but Kimberly gave them none. She floated inside herself, pulled her mind back to Quantico, to field drills and resistance training. Her instructor's voice echoed faintly. "Stay aware. Store details. Name every object in the room. The cell, a single light fixture flickering every 17 seconds, a bolt loose near the bench's base, the smell of mint gum on Oliver's breath, the way Maddox's holster creaked when he shifted weight. When they left quietly, swiftly, she did not scream. She stood up with slow deliberation, walked to the back wall and sat. Blood pounded in her ears. Shame fought to rise, but she pressed it down. Not now. Not here. She counted her heartbeats until they steadied. The hours bled together. At some point, an officer she hadn't seen before brought her a paper cup of water and a sandwich wrapped in plastic. He didn't meet her eyes. Eventually, the door opened again. A senior officer, older with a clipboard and glasses, stood outside. His voice was tired. "You're being released. No charges." Kimberly rose slowly. The hallway outside was colder than the cell. She walked behind the officer in silence, every footstep measuring something permanent inside her. At the front desk, they handed her a bag with her phone wallet keys. "You want to file a complaint?" the receptionist asked flatly. Kimberly looked her in the eye. No, not yet. Outside, the sky had turned overcast. The air tasted like rain. She stood still for a long moment on the station steps, not blinking, not breathing. Then she pulled her phone from the bag, turned it over. She didn't dial her supervisor, didn't text anyone from the bureau. Instead, she opened her private contacts and tapped the name she hadn't used in years. Walter Bennett. The call rang twice. Kim. The voice came gravelly and familiar. "I need a meeting. Today." "Say when." "An hour. My place." He paused. "Are you safe?" "I'm walking." She ended the call. The short walk to her home felt longer than any surveillance tale she'd ever led. She kept her head down, not out of shame, but calculation. A woman walking home after being arrested was invisible. A badge didn't make her human in their eyes, only vulnerable. Inside her apartment, she went straight to the bathroom, stripped off her jacket shirt and looked in the mirror. Her collarbone bore a purple bruise. Finger marks. She took photos. Each angle, each mark. She didn't flinch. She opened the medicine cabinet, pulled out cotton antiseptic, and a small disposable camera, the one she kept for personal field records. No cloud. No auto-delete. By the time Walter arrived, she had printed the photos on her home scanner, laid them on the table beside a legal pad and a cup of tea. She wore a fresh blouse, sleeves rolled, hair tied back. Her skin still burned, but her spine held straight. Walter took one look at her and didn't sit right away. What happened? She handed him the photos. Who did this? He asked, voice tightening. Kimberly didn't answer directly. She poured another cup of tea. They don't know who I am, she said, and I want to keep it that way. For now, Walter sat slow and deliberate. You want to go through the bureau? She shook her head. They'll bury it. Or worse, use it to stall my work. He exhaled through his nose, studying the bruises. You're going to war with a system that's been protecting them for decades, he said. I know. Walter reached across the table and gently laid a hand over the manila folder she'd placed there, as though closing a book he hadn't finished. The photos, notes, and medical receipts inside spoke loud enough. Still, he said nothing, letting the weight of Kimberly's decisions settle in the room like smoke after gunfire. Outside the kitchen window, wind pushed against the oak branches, sending them tapping against the glass. It sounded like cautious fingers knocking to come in. They think this will blow over. Kimberly finally said, her voice even but stretched thin, that I'll be too humiliated to push forward. Walter rubbed his jaw. They think you're alone. She looked up. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes, those held something old. Not rage, not sorrow. Something harder, steadier. I'll start drafting the complaint, he said. No, she replied. We file it once we've gathered what they didn't cover up. 2 days later, Walter walked the halls of the courthouse, shoes echoing against tile that had seen too many cases buried before trial. He filed the civil rights claim under federal statute, Section 1983, with a motion for expedited proceedings based on egregious misconduct and risk of continued harm. His tone was calm, his language surgical. He was a man who had waited decades to draw blood. Meanwhile, Kimberly moved quietly through Rivergate's back streets, hood pulled low, walking like someone who lived there, not someone sent to investigate it. Her wounds had faded, but the memory hadn't. It burned behind her ribs every time she saw a young woman cross the street at the sight of a cruiser or an old man lower his voice. When police passed by, Mrs. Vasquez wouldn't speak. Her eyes welled up when Kimberly visited, but her lips stayed sealed. Mija, she whispered, touching Kimberly's hand. They watch, always. Kimberly didn't push. Fear had memory, and memory carried weight, but others spoke. A teenage girl named Maribel, barely 17, nail polish, chipped sweatshirt too large, met Kimberly at the rear of a laundromat. She had been stopped twice by Oliver, once for jaywalking, once for attitude. He'd told her he could make things hard if she didn't smile more. Kimberly listened, let the girl speak until her voice cracked. Then she thanked her and left without promises. Later, Lucia brought news. I found a neighbor with doorbell footage, she said, sliding a USB drive onto Kimberly's desk. Caught part of the night they came for Ramona. Faces, clear, and audio. They plugged it into the laptop. The sound was grainy but discernible. She don't need to answer unless we say so. Now move aside. A pause. Then a thud. Kimberly's shoulders tensed. She didn't look away from the screen, but her hand curled into a fist on the table. Lucia said nothing. She didn't have to. Later that night, Walter came over. They met at Kimberly's dining table again. Same tea, same silence. They've lawyered up, he said. City council's spooked. Internal affairs is pretending to be shocked. Kimberly smirked without humor. They'll claim it's procedural. They already are. She nodded, then slid a list across the table. Names, dates, reference numbers. These are complaints filed against Maddox and Oliver. In the last 6 years, she said, all inconclusive. Most weren't even investigated. Walter whistled under his breath. You pull this yourself. No. Someone in the admin office owed me a favor. Walter looked at her. You sure you don't want to let the bureau take this? No. He hesitated, then leaned in. We'll need someone from inside the department. Someone clean. I have a name, she said. Peter Sullivan, patrol sergeant. He was at the precinct the night I was held. I trust him. Will he testify? only anonymously. For now, Walter tapped his pen against the folder. We don't have long. Press is circling, but we can't let this become noise before we hit them. They won't expect me to push this far, she said, especially not without flashing your badge. Kimberly didn't reply. Her fingers traced the rim of her tea mug, slow, methodical. The porcelain had a small chip. She'd never replaced it. It reminded her of her mother's cups. Never perfect, but always enough. Walter shifted in his seat. How are you holding up? She looked at him, then really looked. The lawyer in him wanted a measured answer, something he could work with. But the friend in him, the old friend, deserved more. I'm tired, she said, but I know what I'm doing. He gave a slow nod, then added, You're not the first, but maybe you're the one who gets it heard. She didn't smile, but something passed through her quiet resolve. The next morning, Rivergate woke to news. Civil suit filed against officers. Maddox and Oliver for unlawful arrest and abuse. The headline was tucked beneath stories of weather and sports. But it was there. Real ink. Real record. Inside the station, the two officers sat in their squad car reading it from a phone. Maddox scoffed. Lying bitch. Oliver leaned back, tapping his thumb against the steering wheel. It'll get tossed. Just another mouthy one with a lawyer. They didn't know her name, not yet, but soon the whole city would. The courthouse clock struck 9 as sunlight filtered through tall, grimy windows, pooling faint gold onto the polished floor. Rows of benches creaked under the weight of bodies leaning forward, not in comfort, but in anticipation. The gallery was full. Reporters tapped their phones. Locals whispered in one another's ears, and somewhere near the back, someone clutched a notepad with trembling fingers. Kimberly entered without a word. She wore a dark gray suit, modest, unadorned, her face unreadable. She did not glance toward Maddox or Oliver as she took her seat beside Walter. She didn't need to. Their presence burned in the room like cheap cologne, loud and suffocating. Judge Evelyn Brookshire appeared from behind the bench at precisely 9:03. Stern-eyed and soft-voiced, she commanded the room, not with force, but with control. The courtroom hushed with a reverence usually reserved for funerals and final verdicts. Let's proceed, she said, adjusting her reading glasses. The prosecution moved first. An assistant district attorney, a clean-shaven man in his 40s named Jenkins, rose to address the jury. His voice rang out with rehearsed conviction. This is not a story about misconduct. It's a story about manipulation, he began. The defendant, Kimberly Reyes, approached an active police scene and refused multiple requests to step away. She interfered with lawful procedures, and Walter didn't look up. He only uncapped his pen and began to write. Kimberly's expression still studied the jury box. 12 faces mixed in age and color, but all blank with polite skepticism. One woman, a retired nurse, perhaps kept her arms folded the whole time. Another man somewhere in his 70s chewed the inside of his cheek. When Jenkins pointed toward Kimberly and called her agitated and defiant, one juror leaned forward just slightly. It was subtle, but Walter caught it, and he smiled. By midday, the first piece of video evidence rolled. Grainy footage. A sidewalk. Kimberly's hands at her sides. Her voice calm but firm, just barely audible through background noise. May I see the warrant, officer? Pause. A shadow looms. A sudden jolt. Her body pushed. Her back striking the fence post. Gasps fluttered across the courtroom like moths disturbed from sleep. Jenkins stood stiff beside the monitor, arms crossed as if bracing for wind. The second clip was from a doorbell camera. Same moment, different angle. This time the sound was clearer. Back off, Lady Maddox's voice barked. Unless you want to end up in cuffs. Another pause. Then the unmistakable clink of metal on bone. A younger woman in the back row of the gallery covered her mouth. An older man muttered, Jesus. Kimberly didn't blink. Walter rose slowly when it was his turn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He simply walked to the front of the courtroom, turned to the jury and folded his hands. "What you just saw," he said softly, "was a woman asking a question." He let the sentence breathe. One beat two, and what followed was a pattern. One that will prove is not unique. One that speaks to power unchecked and fear disguised as protocol. He paused again, then turned slightly. "Our case is not built on outrage. It's built on evidence, and truth, however quiet, will be heard." He sat. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. Maddox whispered something to Oliver, who didn't respond. That afternoon, they called Helen Parker to the stand. She wore a lavender sweater and orthopedic shoes. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. "I was out walking my dog," she said, nodding gently. "And I saw Miss Reyes speaking to the officers. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't blocking anything. Just standing there." Walter stepped closer. "And what happened next?" "They shoved her," Helen said, "like she was a threat, like she was trash." "Objection." "Speculation," Jenkins said. "Sustained." The judge ruled. Walter nodded. "Just tell us what you saw." "Ma'am." Helen looked down at her hands, then back up. "They didn't treat her like a person." A long silence followed. Walter thanked her and stepped away. Jenkins tried to rattle her on. Cross asked about her age, her eyesight, her memory. But Helen never flinched. "I know what I saw," she said firmly, "and I know wrong when I see it." Next came the neighborhood footage Lucia had trimmed it to. 1 minute. No sound. Maddox's hand on Kimberly's shoulder. Oliver stepping in close. Kimberly flinching as she was grabbed, dragged. It played on loop. No narration. No courtroom drama. Just cold, unflinching fact. The jury watched in silence. When the lights rose, Walter didn't speak right away. He let the jury absorb it. Then came their final witness for the day, Sergeant Peter Sullivan. He walked like a man who didn't want to be there. But his uniform was pressed. His shoes shined. Walter kept the questions short. "You were on duty the night of Miss Reyes's arrest." "Yes." "Did you see the officers? Maddox and Oliver interact with her?" "I arrived after she'd been detained, but I reviewed the logs and asked about body cam footage. Both devices were listed as non-functional." Again. Sullivan looked at the judge, then the jury. It wasn't the first time Walter stepped forward. "Did either officer ever express views about women who question their authority?" Jenkins stood to object, but the judge held up a hand. "Answer if you can." Sergeant Sullivan nodded, jaw clenched. "I once heard Officer Maddox say, and I quote, 'Any woman who mouths off to me will learn the hard way.'" A gasp rippled across the courtroom. Maddox stood halfway, then sat back down, hard. Walter said nothing. He simply looked at the jury. The courtroom still hadn't recovered from Sullivan's final words. Silence stretched taut and uneasy. Judge Brookshire tapped her gavel, once, sharp restrained. "Let the record reflect the statement. Court will resume after a 15-minute recess." Chairs creaked. Whispers stirred like dry leaves in an autumn wind. Walter didn't speak as he gathered his notes. Kimberly remained still, her hands folded on the table, eyes lowered, not in shame, but readiness. Outside the courthouse, the wind picked up. The flag on the front steps flapped and snapped, echoing faintly through the lobby as people streamed toward vending machines and restroom lines. Walter leaned toward Kimberly, his voice barely above a breath. "It's time," she nodded. When court reconvened, the air had shifted. Reporters leaned in, pens poised. The jury had returned with different eyes, more alert now, more human. Something fragile and volatile lingered just below the surface. Walter rose. "Your Honor," he said, "the defense calls Kimberly Reyes to the stand." A murmur rippled across the room. Maddox stiffened. Oliver blinked twice, throat bobbing. Judge Brookshire peered over her glasses. "Proceed." Kimberly stood slowly, smoothing the front of her jacket. She didn't look at the men across the aisle as she walked forward. She didn't have to. Her heels clicked softly against the floor. The moment she raised her right hand to take the oath, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She took her seat. The microphone crackled softly as Walter approached. "Ms. Reyes," he began, "please tell the jury a bit about yourself." Her voice was even, measured. "I was born in Santa Fe, New Mexico. My father was a probation officer. My mother taught first grade. I earned degrees in criminal justice and forensic psychology. And what led you to your current work? I joined the Bureau 16 years ago. My early work focused on organized crime task forces, but over time I was assigned to internal integrity investigations, specifically law enforcement misconduct." A hush. Even the court clerk paused her typing for a second. Walter paced slowly, one hand in his pocket. "Have you ever investigated officers for excessive force or abuse of power?" "Many." "Have you ever gone undercover?" Kimberly nodded once. "I have." Walter let that hang for a beat. Then, softly, "What is your current role?" "Ms. Reyes." She turned to the jury. "I am a senior field investigator with the FBI's Office of Internal Affairs. My division oversees integrity audits and covert investigations of municipal police departments." The words were calm, unembellished, but they detonated like a shell. "Jenkins?" The prosecutor rose halfway in protest, but Judge Brookshire raised her palm. "Let her finish," Kimberly continued. "At the time of my arrest, I was in the final stages of compiling a field report on the Rivergate Police Department, following a series of complaints involving racial profiling, sexual harassment, and use of force." She turned now toward the defense table, toward Maddox and Oliver. "The events that led to my arrest were not an interruption of my life's work. They were the confirmation of it." Oliver shifted, rubbing his temple. Maddox's face had lost all color. A reporter's pen dropped clattering to the floor. Walter stepped forward. "Ms. Reyes, did you identify yourself as a federal agent that day?" "No, I did not." "Why?" "Because I needed them to act exactly as they believed they could, with impunity." A man in the gallery exhaled audibly. The retired nurse on the jury clasped her hands together. Walter paused for just a breath, then nodded. "No further questions." As he stepped back, Judge Brookshire turned to Jenkins Cross. Jenkins looked down at his notes, then up. "No, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Ms. Reyes, you may step down." Kimberly rose, turned, and walked back to her seat. Only this time, no one looked away from her. The jury took just under 2 hours. Kimberly spent that time in a side room with Walter and Lucia. No one spoke much. The room smelled of paper and stale coffee. A clock ticked so loud it felt like a countdown. When the bailiff called them back, Kimberly didn't flinch. In the courtroom, everyone had returned. The air was thick with something close to reverence. The foreperson, a woman in a pale blue sweater, stood as the judge addressed her. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor. Please proceed." "In the case of Kimberly Reyes versus Officers Maddox and Oliver, we find the defendants guilty on all counts." A beat of silence, then a collective exhale. Not cheers, not applause, just breath. Relief, like a city had been holding it in for far too long. Judge Brookshire nodded solemnly. "The court thanks the jury for its service. Sentencing will be scheduled within 30 days. Both officers are hereby suspended, pending federal review." Maddox stood, then sat again as if unsure whether to flee or freeze. Oliver stared at the table, eyes hollow. Walter leaned slightly toward Kimberly. "It's done." Kimberly didn't answer. Walter not with words, anyway. She nodded once, just enough to acknowledge the moment, but not enough to let it carry her away. Victory was a strange thing. It didn't ring like a bell. It settled like dust after a long, violent wind. Outside the courthouse steps were crowded. Reporters pressed forward, their microphones and cameras jostling like hungry birds. Flashbulbs popped. A dozen voices shouted her name. "Ms. Reyes Kimberly, just one question." She didn't stop. Lucia moved ahead of her, carving a quiet path through the noise. Walter followed behind, shielding Kimberly with his presence as if sensing the weight she carried was no longer hers alone. At the curb, a black sedan waited. Lucia opened the door and Kimberly slid inside without turning back. The car pulled away, leaving behind 100 unanswered questions and the low thrum of city breath. By the following week, her face had been on every local channel. Cable news picked it up soon after, less for the legal nuances than for the twist they couldn't stop repeating. FBI agent posed as civilian exposes corrupt officers in undercover operation gone wrong. She didn't respond. No interviews, no comment. Instead, she met with an accountant, then with a non-profit director she trusted. The settlement quietly negotiated before trial and quietly accepted after the verdict was enough to do something meaningful. And so she did. The Vasquez Legal Support Fund, named after the woman whose silence first opened Kimberly's eyes, was established 2 months after the verdict. Its mission was clear legal aid for survivors of institutional abuse, particularly those too afraid or too poor to speak alone. The first donation came from Kimberly herself. No speeches, no ribbon cuttings, just a wire transfer. Rivergate changed too, though not all at once. The police chief retired early. 3 captains were reassigned. A state oversight committee swept in with clipboards and body cameras, installing independent investigators where closed-door briefings used to be. Old complaints once filed and forgotten were reopened. Patterns emerged clear as footprints in wet cement. Some officers resigned quietly, others lawyered up. The city council released a statement promising transparency, reform, and accountability. It read well. Time would test whether it meant anything. One morning, Kimberly walked past the Rivergate precinct. She didn't linger, just glanced once at the front entrance where a new plaque had been mounted beneath the city seal: to serve without bias, to protect without fear. The words were polished. The metal still smelled of fresh weld. She kept walking. Walter, in his own quiet way, became a reluctant public figure. A magazine profile called him the gentleman who took on the badge. A law school invited him to speak at commencement. He declined when a journalist caught him outside his office and asked how it felt to win a case of that magnitude. He replied without pause, "I didn't win anything," he said. "I did my job." The woman who stood up in that courtroom, she's the one who fought. Months passed. Then the letter came. It was embossed in federal blue, signed by the deputy director of the bureau. "We'd like your case file for training materials." Kimberly reread it twice, not out of doubt, but out of care. The words were respectful, almost reverent. They wanted her to speak, to teach, to make sure others knew what to do when silence wasn't an option. The next time she walked through the doors at FBI headquarters, she wasn't undercover. She was the instructor. Her presentation was clipped to a manila folder like any other file, but on the inside were the names, the dates, the voices they tried to ignore. A photo sat on her desk that morning, her mother in her classroom, chalk in hand, her father in uniform smiling softly, a reminder of where this all began and why it couldn't end here. In time, she would return to Rivergate quietly, not to relive anything, just to see it for what it had become. Lucia came with her. They passed the corner where Mrs. Vasquez's garden bloomed again. New neighbors tended it now, but the smell of rosemary still lingered. A mural had been painted across the brick wall of the grocery store. It showed a woman not quite Kimberly, but close standing, firm, her back straight, eyes open. Behind her, 12 small stars formed a circle. At the bottom, in careful script, "Ask the question anyway." Lucia stood beside her. "That phrase is everywhere now," she said. Kimberly gave a small nod. "It should be." And together they stood in the late autumn light, not as victims or witnesses, but as women who refused to be erased. The story of Kimberly Reyes is a powerful journey of resilience, justice, and silent strength. From the moment she is wrongfully arrested to the day she stands in court, revealing her true identity as a senior FBI investigator. Her path is marked by quiet determination and unshakable dignity. What makes Kimberly's journey so compelling is not just her bravery in exposing a corrupt system, but her refusal to let anger or vengeance define her actions. She moves with grace carefully, collecting truth and waiting for the right moment to strike, not for herself alone, but for every silenced voice like hers. The story leaves a deep, emotional impression because it speaks to the reality that power can be abused, but it can also be challenged by truth, by courage, by a single woman who refuses to back down. Kimberly's creation of a legal aid fund and her refusal to seek fame shows the moral core of her character. The human lesson here is clear. Dignity is not in what we endure, but in how we respond. True justice doesn't begin with loud declarations. It begins with one person daring to ask a hard question and refusing to be ignored. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.